Just a reminder, the session is being recorded. Your face and your voice may be present in the recording, and it'll be posted on the statistics YouTube channel so that other people can benefit from this talk. So feel free to leave your camera off, and if you want one of us to ask your questions for you, we're happy to do that too. So I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Evelyn Asiedu. Asiedu.
Oh,
There we go.
Yeah, you got it.
Dr. Asiedu holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry with honors, a PhD in Analytical Environmental Toxicology, and she's completed a postdoctoral fellowship with Environment and Climate Change Canada. Dr. Asiedu was born in Toronto. She's the second daughter of immigrants from Ghana, Africa, and in the summer of 2020, she called for Canadian universities to collect race-based data in an opinion piece in Maclean's. And she's currently doing this work she called for in her present position as an EDI data analyst at Thompson Rivers University. She's contributing to the development of strategies to identify and dismantle barriers to participation of all people on campus. And specifically, her aim is to set goals and establish methods that systematically measure progress towards their achievement. And I'll let her tell you more about this. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. I was just telling Sasha, I literally just finished making my slides like 1 hour ago. So like, let's see how this goes. There's also a little bit of a lag with the slides, so I apologize in advance. I'm not sure why the slides are not advancing. Okay, so Sasha did a land acknowledgement. I too will do a land acknowledgement. I'm very thankful to be here on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And these are the First Nations who have stewarded this land for many, many years. And I'm thankful, and I hope that this work can lead to reconciliation and inclusion as we learn together. On a day-to-day basis, I'm at Thompson Rivers University, which is on the traditional lands of the Chikwamulu, and that includes First Nations as the Spatium, Secotlan, Newhook, Delech, and Nihilkuk people. And it looks kind of like this now. I know y'all haven't got snow yet in Vancouver, but we have in the last couple of weeks, but it's still a wonderful, beautiful place, and I'm really thankful to have my position there. So before we get into this, I will let everyone know that there are some components which may trigger people, which cause some discomfort. Feel free to take the time that you need to languish in that discomfort, leave the room if you need to, but we will talk through it, and I hope it'll be okay. I will also give another note that I don't have the answers, so let's just start there. Lower expectations. This is more of a conversation. So what we'll do today is we'll start out by talking about history, Canadian history briefly. We'll move into a discussion about what are the barriers for success in higher education related to racialized and or marginalized people. We'll have a brief discussion about inclusive excellence, what that means, and what higher education institutions are doing in that name, and also considerations for socio-demographic data collection, which is part of the work that I do at TRU. We'll also look at alternative qualitative strategies to equity and data collection. But before we get into any of that, I wanted to start off with a brief story. A couple of weeks ago on Twitter, one of my colleagues, Marianne Andrade, who is a professor at University of Toronto, had posted this onto Twitter. And essentially you can see her kind of looking up at her hair and or / rolling her eyes and saying she's tired of being checked when she goes through security at airports. And that's because she wears her hair naturally. She has an afro. I right now am wearing a wig. I also have an afro underneath this. But for many reasons, I choose not to wear my hair out and naturally. But anyways, you can see in the image here, it says afro pat down again at Pearson Airport, which is Toronto, because you have a product in your hair. Seriously, would actually rather they have just said it's because an afro was not considered in the design of the scanner, so your natural hair is undesirable. And these are small and or large instances that people of color, including Black women such as Mediane and myself, experience on a day-to-day basis, and small, subtle reminders that technology, different parts of society were not made with certain people in mind. That being said, Sasha, again, thank you for the introduction. Trying to just give a reminder of how I got into this work. I was writing my PhD thesis in 2020 in the field of analytical environmental toxicology, and at that time, COVID had started. And so we were all scrolled away in our homes. And on the one hand, I was like, okay, well, at least I'm not missing anything. But on the other hand, it was like really stressful. It's really stressful writing a thesis, as many of you know, but also at that time, across North America, we were going through a racial reckoning, obviously triggered by the George Floyd murder in the States and the protests, which then were inspired from, in the States, but across the world. And so, writing my thesis, when I go to take a break, it's like just a barrage of Twitter posts, Instagram posts, it's CBC News, everybody's talking about this all the time, and there is no escaping it. And as much as I tried, I realized that it wasn't something that I could avoid anymore. I had already tried for many years in my PhD to ignore the small things, small reminders that, I'm the only one, often the only Black person in the room, the only Black woman in the room, whether it's someone, can I touch your hair? Or, somebody shakes everybody's hand that comes to me and gives me a kind of a fist bump, little weird things that remind me that I'm not like everyone else. And so to process my feelings, I wrote a letter. Initially, it was meant to be shared with my friends and family, friends who had not approached me at the time. I'm not sure probably because they didn't know what to say, even though I knew that they loved me. I was felt kind of more isolated because I didn't hear from them. And so I wrote a letter for them, and then I shared it with a few people. And one of my friends actually said, this is really good. You should consider getting it published. And I'm like, what does that mean? Like, I don't know what that is. And she helped me through the process of pitching it to a few different publications, and it eventually did land in the claims, as Sasha had mentioned. So my article titled, Canadian Universities Need to Collect Race-Based Data, was giving a story as to what life looks like for someone like me, a Black woman specifically, but really can be extrapolated to marginalized people in post-secondary institutions, and giving people an anecdote to think about what are the reasons for demographic data collection. In Canada, we tout inclusivity and multiculturalism, and I think for the most part, Canadians are good people. I'm Canadian, I was born here as well, but of course there has not been up until this point really any data at post-secondaries to validate those claims. So that's essentially what my article talked about. So in 2021, I moved to Kamloops in BC, which is just about 2.5 hours from here. And I was hired as part of this Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Capacity Building Grant. And so that grant is administered by NSERC, but is a tri-agency initiative. So that's NSERC, so that's the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and Canadian Institute of Health Research. Those are the three agencies which comprise tri-agency, and they're all promoting this EDI capacity building grant that is just overseen by NSERC. And essentially it was awarded to several smaller post-secondary institutions, of which Thompson River University is one, and that's the grant I was hired out of it. So getting into a brief history, I'm not going to go too deep into it, but essentially this history largely focuses on the relationship with Black people to Canada and in Canada, starting as far as 1833, when slavery was abolished in the British Empire, which includes the lands of Canada. Separate schools were instituted just before in the 1900s, and immigration policies which influenced many people of color, many settlers were discriminated against, including African Americans and Africans who were deemed unsuitable, saying things like the temperature's too cold for such people, which really it was just racism. But the government has interesting ways to exclude people. In 1953, Fair Employment Practices Act, which was instituted by the federal government, with the essentially saying that everybody had the right to be employed. Segregated schools mostly ended in the 60s, for the exception of a few. I think one, the last one closed, I want to say in the 90s somewhere. I'll have to double check that. Canadian Human Rights Act in 1977 was the baseline for our Constitution, and the Voluntary Affirmative Action Program had started in 1978, largely promoted by the federal government. So around that same time, there was a Judge Rosalie Abella, who was responsible for looking into employment equity. At that time, it was employment equality, seeing who was working at federal government agencies and how they were treated, and essentially the long and short of it is that she did say that yes, there is discrimination. People are unequally being employed and being promoted in federal government agencies, and that's a problem. And so from that came the federal contractors program, where essentially any institution which receives funds from the federal government must report on who they're employing and must abide by the rules of employment at that time equality, now employment equity. So that's like whizzing through Canadian history, but of course there's a few things I didn't talk about, and they are important, so just kind of touching on them here. Of course, there's the Indian Act and residential schools, which led to and were part of the genocide of Indigenous people, which many of us have taken time to learn about. Part of the reason why we do land acknowledgements to remember that we are all settlers here, save Indigenous people. Talking about immigration discrimination, and as I mentioned, it's not just African Black people or African people or Black people who are discriminated against by immigration. There was Japanese and others in the period of the 1800s till now. There was the Chinese head tax, which for Chinese immigrants, they had to pay a certain amount of money or to come, and it was really just a way to discourage people from immigrating here, even though the majority of immigrants were doing labor jobs. These are unordered, but exclusion of Jewish refugees, during World War II. There was the turning away of East Asian, specifically Indian Sikh people who came on a boat, and Canada was like, nah, and sent them back, and lots of people died. It was really bad. And even Ukrainian people who were sent into concentration camps and termed enemy aliens around the time of World War II. So lots of discrimination all around in our history, and I think we're all just coming to terms with that. There were also things like the race riots in 1907, which happened here in Vancouver. So that was Indian people, Chinese, Japanese people, and I think that the riots were in opposition to the changing demographics of Vancouver. And so y'all can look up all of that. I have a shorthand sheet, which I downloaded from somewhere on the internet. If you want, I can share that. But of course, none of this also touches on statistics and the history of statistics and objectivity. So these are two statisticians, which I'm sure many of you know. So if you all heard this already, I'm sorry. We're just going to say that there's people online who might not have heard this, and so we'll just talk through it. But two leaders in thought in terms of statistics and math, Francis Galton and Charles Darwin. Of course, Charles Darwin being the father of evolution. And this photo here of the origin of species. So talking about natural selection and the idea that only the strongest survive, and that's the way that it should go. I will say here that I took these slides from my friend Kara Ellis, who actually did her postdoc here at UBC. She and I met at U of A. She is a statistician, and so she made these slides for a different talk and did them in such a good way that I didn't bother. Didn't have time to make new slides. So I'm just using them here and referencing her. She's great, and I'm thankful that she lent me these slides. So one important person at this time was Adolf, I can't pronounce his name, it's Quetelet, and applied the Gaussian distribution to human traits, saying that things like our chest and weight and things like that can be described on a curve. And imagine people who have deviations from the average man, average being, whatever this guy thought, I guess. And he actually was the person to invent BMI, body mass index, related to all of these different parameters of the body. So this was a way for Galton to grade people and scale people based on a objective spectrum. He and Carl Pearson, with his years of existence here, actually got to know each other. Pearson's correlation coefficient and many other statistical tests. And so these two people came together and they became superstars of statistics / eugenics. Crazy. So the subtitle here saying Carl Pearson, who's on the left, referred to eugenics as the directed and self-conscious evolution of the human race, which he and Francis Galton, to the right, understood that with the enthusiasm of a prophet. So just really the tenets of this, this discipline. And they produced documents such as these two, the one on the left in 1901 by Carl Pearson, from the standpoint of science, and the one on the right by Galton, Probability, the Foundation of Eugenics, and really widely distributed these publications and really influenced the way that even now, the way we think about statistics and race, actually. And so just a quote here from National Life from the standpoint of science. I'm just going to read it out loud. So it says, history shows me one way, and one way only, in which a high state of civilization has been produced, namely the struggle of race with race, and the survival of physically and mentally fitter race. If you want to know whether lower races of a man can evolve a higher type, I fear the only course is to leave them to fight it out among themselves. And even then, the struggle for existence between individual and individual, between tribe and tribe, may not be supported by the physical selection due to a particular climate on which probably so much of the Aryans' success depended. So essentially, this dude just really was all for like people killing each other, white people as being the best, and that's the way that he thought race works, and those thoughts have permeated society even until now. Of course, science is only as objective as the people who are doing it. This is the main point. So thank you for enduring that digression. But going back to Canadian history, leading off from the Abella report, the outcome of that, as I mentioned before, was federal contractors program, and it took all of that until for us to get to modern times. That's within the last 20 years, where Canadian universities are starting to publish on instances of racism, anti-Black racism, discrimination on campus, and that's still happens even today. We all know around Halloween everybody gets a little bit weird, right? So it's just a thing that still happens. So the federal contractors program, the threshold was raised, inflation, et cetera, not super important. But it wasn't until 2017 that NSERC instituted the Canada Research Chair Action Plans. And so by that regard, it is of the mind of trying to see, and I think of many scientists now, that previously the funding was not being distributed equitably. It was largely being distributed to people who looked the same and or had the same productivity, however we define that. And so now the Canadian government has recognized that that needs to change, and a few slides I'll tell you why. But essentially, this is what you'll see if you go to the CRC Canada Research Chairs Program. They require any research institution which will be employing Canada Research Chairs to adhere to and abide by the EDI action plan, basically describing how this institution plans to get to certain equity targets. Of course, the CRC being a very prestigious prize, lots of money, lots of eyes on your research institution and your research, and so it's a really credible program, especially in the context of the Canadian higher education. But of course, this only came as a result of a lawsuit. So there's 7 women here who, in I forget how long ago, I might say here, 2003. So it says, yeah, 2003, there's Marjorie Griffin Cohen, Louise Forsyth, Glennis Joyce, Audrey Kobayashi, Susan Prentice, Wendy Robbins, Michelle Olivier, and missing one of them, Sri Mule, I think. They brought an argument to the Canadian Supreme Court, essentially saying that, like, this is weird. Like, why is it always the same people, essentially same group of people getting CRC prizes? And they basically said that women, from the position of women, women were not receiving the prize at similar or equal levels, and they won because it's true, and that's part of why we have the CRC action plan. And so, even though we know there's many publications talking about diversity breeds innovation and all the positive things for why diversity is important in science. Diversity means more innovation. We still see things like this, professors within universities or leaving universities as a result of diversity and equity targets, promotion, things of this sort. So contentious figure here, Jordan Peterson, who's you know, from the University of Toronto, why I'm no longer a tenure professor at the University of Toronto. So he left and, you know, was able to withhold emeritus status. This was, you know, at the beginning of this year, so about 11 months ago. But this is not the only of this type of thought, or he's not the only one of this type of thought. Many people are arguing against changes in equity and things like that. But things are changing. So, I mean, these are the targets. So the CRC NSERC targets for representation based on 2021, and where I guess the program aims to be by 2029. So in another few years here. And so based on the, in this case, for protected groups. So there's visible minorities, Indigenous people, persons with disabilities, and women and gender minorities. And so you can see that the targets for visible minorities, close to the 21.5% based on the census, and the goal for 29 is to move that just marginally. So we're doing pretty good for that. Indigenous people looking to increase by about 1.7%. Persons with disabilities increased by 2% or so, and then women and gender minorities looking to increase that by quite a bit. More than 10%. Just have a few asterisks here, knowing that the target is lower for persons with disabilities because we know that people often don't consider themselves as having a disability. Not only that, is there's still a stigma to the idea of disability. So oftentimes that needs to be contextualized, and so it's not just a matter of, you know, do you have problems seeing? Do you have problems hearing? It's like, do you experience anxiety? Do you have trouble moving your hands and things like that? So that is something that is still an ongoing discussion, I think, in these circles. And so all of this are meant to increase the amount of talent in the Canadian research ecosystem. What I have here is a schema of talent when it comes to higher education. I have the example here of Black prospects, Black people, and the pipeline being this analogy, the leaky pipeline, where talent is lost along the lines from undergrad to tenure professorships. So starting from left to right, you have a large amount of undergrads, or at least the largest amount of Black people are seen in undergraduate. And as you go on to from doctorate to postdoc, associate professor, and tenure professor, there's fewer and fewer in between. So this phenomenon is described as the leaky pipeline, which is the loss of talent as they pursue careers in STEM. And so the question is, how can we use a systematic approach to increase the number of Black professionals, substitute this word here, marginalized, racialized professionals in STEM, and or decrease the loss of such people in STEM. And those are the types of things that I think about in my research. And so going into some observations, what we know, before we talk about that, just spending a bit of time on language. In the previous slides, I had said visible minority. Visible minority is the term which the federal government used. It's seen in Statistics Canada. It's not my preferred terminology. Racialized is I think, a more appropriate term because it describes what the social phenomenon is occurring. More than that, minority implies some hierarchy, but also just in terms of number, we know that minorities, people, racialized people are increasing generally, and that what is that minority? What that means might change anyways. Just if we're thinking of the word itself in a neutral way. Moving to words like non-racialized instead of white, and so that again speaks to the social systems which are being employed. Indigenous people are not racialized, so Indigenous people are the original people. They're not of race as the social construct implies. And while we focus, I will focus on four or five protected groups in this presentation. There can be up to 8 depending on where you live, looking at the provincial government guidelines and things of the sort. And I took this from a report from the Royal Society of Chemistry, which I find very interesting. And the title is at the bottom of the slide. So if we're just taking the Black population as an example, this slide is just meant to show that the Black population in Canada is very young. So what that means is that compared to other other groups, there will be more and more Black people entering into the labor force, entering into post-secondary over the next few years. So the median age of the Black population, at least at the time of the 2016 census, was just less than 30%, compared to, less than 30 years compared to about 40 years of the total population. So 10 years younger or so than most of the population. And of that portion, about a quarter of those are kids who are 15 years or younger. This slide here, looking at the perspectives of Black children, Black youth. So this was according to a survey that was done by Stats Canada. And while most youth between the ages of 15 and 25 want a university degree, only 60% of those believe that they will obtain a university degree. And so what you're seeing here on this graph, y-axis percent of respondents, and the x-axis is would like a degree and believe they would get a degree. So this is comparing what Black people compared to everyone else think, where the Black population is in yellow and the navy blue is everyone else. And you can see statistical differences in at least showing that most Black kids want a degree, or they did in 2016. And that was significantly different than the rest of the population, which is interesting. And so lots of work has been done in this regard concerning specifically the Black population. This is Carl James, who I fangirl over because it's really cool. He works at York University and studies a number of things, but specifically what's the impact of stereotype and how does that translate into primary and post-secondary, primary, secondary, and post-secondary institutions. And based on some of his research, we see that there has been an impact, at least in Ontario. So in Toronto specifically, so I grew up in Brampton. There is, the way that high school works is that there was academic or applied, and so academic was meant for students who are going off to university and are really smart or whatever, and applied as for like hands-on / college preparation. And the influence which guidance counselors and teachers and stereotypes have on putting a student into one or the other is hugely impactful. And so as a result of some of this research by Carl James and others, that streaming process, so either applied or academic, has been removed. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens as a result. And so, right, so Ontario to end discriminatory practice of academic streaming in grade 9. And this came out about 2 years ago, which I thought was very cool. And so looking at, and more specifically at post-secondary, this is taken from a study from Milton and Canilla in 2015. And this is focused on research that was done in the States, but essentially thinking about when you're cold emailing somebody to join their research lab or even just have a first interaction with somebody, what is the likelihood that you'll hear back? And so what these researchers did is that they, as it says in blue at the bottom, survey of 6,500 or so fictional emails were sent to tenure-track professors in 259 PhD granting universities in the US, and this happened in 2010. So essentially the emails were all structured the same, very similarly. Anyway, the only difference was the naming that was used, the names that were used in those fictional emails. So choosing names that may have signaled somebody from India or someone from China or somebody from America, for example, and looking at the response rates. And so what you're seeing here is on the y-axis, the different disciplines. So looking at the natural physical sciences and math, life sciences, health sciences, engineering, and computer science. And on the x-axis, we're calling they call that the discriminatory gap. So what is the difference in the response rate compared to fictional emails sent by white males? And so bottom line here is that in fact the numbers were less likely to respond to women and visible minorities at the time, visible minorities being non-white people, I guess. And you can see that it changes, or it did change based on the discipline, where health science, engineering, and computer sciences and engineering had the widest discriminatory gap based on their studies. Speaking more personally, this book, they said this would be fun, came out by Attorney Martis. a memoir of her personal experiences as a undergraduate student at Western University. I actually did my undergrad at Western University, and so was able to recognize and relate to a lot of that. But talking about what life is like as a, for her, a mixed race, Black appearing woman at a Canadian post-secondary institution. It's quite an interesting read, so I encourage you all to take some time to do that. But really just talking about what racism looks like today. More evidence. This book I love. This is by a number of researchers from Canadian institutions called The Equity Myth. So what does that look like for lecturers, researchers, professors at Canadian universities? And they look at a number of things based on surveys and interviews. One of the things they looked at was the career progression of faculty members. And so this is just looking specifically at the number of faculty members per discipline, if we're looking at racialized versus non-racialized people. So where are people, if they're faculty, where in what disciplines are they? And you can see that there is there's statistical difference in how many racialized people are present in business, medicine and math, and social science. Okay, so there's about 2,436 people who are part of the survey, and about 60% responded, and a third of those responded to the whole survey. Other things like how long it takes to become a professor. You're looking at the difference between racialized and non-racialized people. Biggest takeaway here is that there is a statistical difference in the time which it takes for racialized people to become full professors if you're comparing it to non-racialized people. So it takes about 3 years longer, according to the research that was done by Henry et al. And of course, there's also an associated and reflective impact on earnings of faculty members. This is a study that was done by the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which looks at the difference of in pay. And so essentially the bottom line is that there's a 14% or so earnings gap for Black teachers being professors and researchers at post-secondaries in Canada. So it's essentially this all kind of comes together to say that racialized professors endure a lot. They go through a lot. I'm not a racialized professor, I'm a postdoc, but those who make it to that point feel that they have to be the best. They have to be better than everybody else to get just as much. And not only that, they have to oftentimes mentor students who see themselves in that professor. So if there is only one, say one brown professor for every 200 students who happen to be in that institution, then oftentimes that professor has to deal with the emotional burden and mentorship without very little support. And more than that, universities don't often recognize the toll that takes. They don't necessarily equate that with tenure and promotion, and so that has an effect too. So things that we could ask of the system, things that would be good to know if we had socio-demographic information, for example, is what, in this case, I took this from a presentation I did for chemistry, but what do students in chemistry, this in statistics, look like, and how does that change over time? What proportion of students in statistics or chemistry have done research, and how does that impact their experience of belonging, but also their success in post-secondary more generally? For faculty, we can ask things like, would there be an impact if we put an increased weighting for service? So that's like mentorship and support of students in tenure promotion applications. And how long do racialized faculty stay at universities? Because I know anecdotally that oftentimes racialized professors tend to leave universities. There's a higher turnover because of all these things that I've touched on already today. Okay, so where do we start? How do we start? Is there even a way to address this? And I think that there is. Most of us in the room are scientists, and so my thought is that why don't we use the scientific method, a systematic approach to question our system? So where the method is to observe the system, ask a question, introduce an intervention, monitor, analyze, and then report, and then do it, do it again. It's cyclical. Why don't we do that with demographics and Canadians post-secondary? I think that we can. Luckily enough, in the last few years, many universities have started to collect race-based data. This is an example from the University of Toronto, who launched their first student equity census in 2020, I want to say. That brings us to inclusive excellence. So this is the Dimensions Charter, which is endorsed by the federal government, or is created by the federal government, but endorsed by Universities Canada, which is a consortium of post-secondary institutions. And so essentially in this charter, which is publicly available, you can find it online, there's 9 or so principles to inclusive excellence, what we can do at Canadian post-secondaries to be more inclusive. And I think that it's great, but I do think that there's something to be said about the terminology inclusive excellence. This is something that's being spoken about in some circles in terms of what does that mean? What does it mean to be excellent? Who's defining what that means and who's doing the including, right? Mm-hmm. So this is just, I know there's a lot of feelings about all this stuff already, but I just wanted to throw one more at you just to make sure you're still listening. So Universities Canada, as I mentioned, endorses this charter, and in 2019, they did a survey of Canadian post-secondaries to see which data is being collected. And so this happened from February to June of that year. About 92% of the universities responded to at least one third of the survey. And most of the respondents were about the president, or were from the president or president perspectives. They were by EDI leads and or touched on self-identification data, mainly due to employee equity surveys, I believe. And so top findings, most places collect age, gender, but not sexual orientation. Not many places discuss what the composition of the leadership is. So that's board, senate, and committees. Most of the data was about staff and not students. So, and if there was data collected on students, it was mainly about Indigenous identity, and much less were asked about racialized students, or the race of students, and or disability. And then most of those focused on undergrads and not graduate students. And then what I thought was also interesting is that citizenship, ethnicity, first-gen status, language, social economic status, and religion were not collected. And of course, these are all different parameters which make us complex people and are part of who we are and would impact the way that we experience belonging or exclusion at a university. So luckily enough, in the last few years, there have been efforts by many universities to increase diversity, to intentionally make equity targets. And some of these are shown here. So the University of Alberta, my alma mater, University of Waterloo, and McMaster all have done cluster hires. So have intentionally recruited a group of Black or racialized faculty at the same time. And what that does, it creates a cohort, which on one hand, I hope makes it easier for the faculty members as they attend, but also on the other hand, gives, I hope, everybody else at the university an understanding of why this is important. But that'll depend on the institution itself. I took a course last year by Heather Krause. It's called We All Count, and it talks about using a protocol or a system to think about how equity projects can be implemented in post-secondary. And so this is a figure which is taken directly from her slides. And I think it's really, really interesting thinking about if we are collecting people's data, how do we do it in a way that empowers them, starting from the very beginning in terms of where the funding sources come from, why are we doing it, how are we going to design the project to answer specific questions, how are we going to store it, analyze it, interpret it. The data story is very important, of course, and distribute that information, all components of a good EDI data project. I specifically focus on these three things in my work. So data collection, analysis, and interpretation are close to my heart. But more than that, what I've been working on recently is qualitative data. So we can get the numbers and we can get the figures, but what does that mean? And without asking people about their experiences, we don't know. So this is the vision statement for TRU. In the background is a pack of wolves, which is a symbol for our campus. So just reading it here, it says, we aim to be community-minded with a global conscious. We will redefine the university as a place of belonging or consultants. We are all related and interconnected with nature, each other, and all things, where all people are empowered to transform themselves, their world, their community, excuse me, and their world. And so the question is this true? Like, how do we know that, right? So that's kind of what I hope to answer in certain ways through my own research. And so the question is there data to support the institutional values? And these are all, again, part of the TRU mission. You can find them on the website. One of the values being inclusion and diversity, community mindedness, curiosity, and sustainability. And so I'm wondering if we can take key phrases from these values and turn them into questions that we can ask stakeholders about their experience. So asking if they do feel welcome, do they feel that we come together? Do we feel like we embrace change, and do we encourage wellness or support the wellness of people? And so what this is essentially like taking the values, which are kind of this abstract, soft, weird thing, and using it hopefully to create metrics, or to at least make sense of that metrics. So I think that by gaining a context and speaking with people, we can create, we can turn this kind of weird fuzzy thing into more hard and concrete numbers, and better understand our universities. So it's just another nice figure here. Sorry, lots of pop-ups, but context is created with consultation. So essentially just emphasizing that we need to talk to people and that numbers don't just exist in a vacuum. And so that's what I've been doing, or that's what I did in the fall and spring of this year, speaking to stakeholders about their experiences. So that project is the cultural mapping of equity, diversity, and inclusion at Thompson Rivers University, to better understand how everybody's doing at TRU. So how this works is we use a draw talk protocol. So essentially we start off with a research question. We give them a piece of paper with some like nice drawing materials, give them some snacks, put on some like soft music, and make sure there's always windows. And then we like, ask them on one side of the page to say, can you define what EDI, what equity, diversity, inclusion mean to you? And I always let them know, like, you can look it up on your phone. Like, I don't care. We're just trying to get you thinking about these things for yourself. Not looking for a right answer. And then once they've done that, I ask them to flip over the page and ask them to depict where on campus, where at TRU they've had experiences of equity, diversity, inclusion, either positive and or negative. And so what that does, in the end, it produces a piece of art, like a physical piece of paper, which people have drawn on, which is pretty cool. But also with that, once they're done, I ask them to take me on a tour of the map, take me through what they've drawn, and all questions are all derived from what they've drawn. So there's no preconceived questions other than that first question. Once they're done, so the interviews are recorded, and once that's done, I provide them with a demographic sheet, which had about 7 questions or so. Every question, prefer not to say. So lots of data, which can be collated to understand the experience of EDI. So in summary, they make a picture, you talk to them, you do that a bunch of times, and that can help them to build a community context. It's a community conversation about what EDI means. And what you get from that is images like this. So from October 17th to October 28th, I actually became an art curator, apparently, which was crazy. But the TRU does have an art gallery, and I was able to, felt very honored to be able to display the pieces of work that community members made. There's 48 pieces on the wall, but ultimately 132 people participated from February to August. Myself and my research team were able to do that. And so these are two examples of the types of work that people produce, or the types of art that people produce, and you can see that they're very interesting. So what we do, what we will be doing, is using a schema. So Kevin Lynch from Forever Go talked about mapping it as a way to understand place, and so there's 5 kind of high-level parameters which are used to define, you can categorize a map into, so whether that's like a path or an edge or a landmark, or a couple others I'm forgetting, of course. But that's like the way to look at an image and analyze it, but there's also inductive themes that you get out from the interview. So what can you pull out of the map that came out from what someone said, and how does it show up in the image? And so there's things like color and shape and space, and all of that is helpful to understand what people are talking about to come up with the recurring themes. And we do have about 20 or so major themes which we've been able to deduce, or induce, I should say, and hoping to produce a methodology paper, but also just a summary paper on what that looked like at TRU. So other things we need to think about in terms of post-secondary Canada, international enrollment is increasing. From, you can see here, from 2020 to 2020, the number of study permits increased by 6 times or so, from 10,000 to about 70,000, tapering off around 2020, and that's probably impacted also by COVID. And on the right-hand side, just the leading places from which study permit holders are coming. So this is an important discussion to thinking about how our demographics on campus are changing, and how we need to think about cultural sensitivities and things of this sort in terms of EDI. What are we thinking about? What am I thinking about in terms of disaggregated data? So I'm working with a number of people, but I spoke at a conference in Seattle with 2 of my colleagues about the, oops.
Oh, you have to,
I don't know how to. Talking about what collecting disaggregated data does. So just reading what it says here: recognize potential for disaggregated data to reinforce stigmatization of communities that, if we don't take care, this data can do harm, perpetuate inequities. And so because of harmful impacts of colonialism on marginalized communities, and potential for groups to be categorized in misleading ways based on biases and practices, we want to make sure that we're being thoughtful in what data we're collecting, and how we're presenting the data, and what we're saying when we eventually report back on this data. Oh crap, sorry, this is my bad. But basically just thinking about how do we do this without hurting people. And one important publication which speaks to this is the Grandmother Perspective. This came out from out of BC, so here for all of us who are in this room, speaking about the ways to consider collecting data and what the purpose is. So the quote here says, First Nations governments are not wanting to operate with the big brother mentality that we've all been groomed into believing in relation to what data does to us. It's more like we want to come from the grandmother perspective. We need to know because we care. So using more empathy, using more compassion, and also just thinking about historical harms before we collect this data. And this is a publicly available document which all of you can access. In the last few years, there have been commitments by post-secondaries, including the Scarborough Charter, which is on anti-Black racism and inclusion in the post-secondaries. And so many post-secondaries, the ones shown here at least, the presidents have signed on to endorse this charter, which thinks about Black communities on campus and committing to changes in terms of learning, pedagogy, research, things like that. More than that, also we have a number of leadership positions being created in EDI, including these 3 women here, these 3 Black women here at universities across the country. Really, I hope what that means is that there's a commitment institutionally to actually see EDI implemented and see changes in the next few years. And so the question is, of course, how will we know when this is working? Scientists always want to know. When can it stop? Nobody knows. We can benchmark. We can, start by the first thing to do is to start by making observations, and based on context, ask questions about things we'd like to see change, and measure as we go. But no one really knows where this will lead us. But I think that we're all on the right track. Just wanted to take a second here to point out to positive changes. Nature publication in 2020, just a couple weeks ago, really about a month ago. This is online as well, talking about racism, experiences of racism by post-secondary researchers, lecturers, etc. Talking about a number of things, not just human pieces, but also interesting things like the impacts of skin color on medical oxygen sensors. So going back to how design, research, and science can impact people on life or death, like real levels. More than that, what I think is one of the most interesting things I've seen in the last little while is the work that was done by, I'm going to forget their names, but there was two Black scholars who used AI to, or evaluated how facial recognition was failing Black people, failing not just Black people, but people with darker skin. And so they created their own database of faces based on leaders in governments from 7 countries where there was gender parity, and designed an experiment where they looked at the ability for software to accurately recognize either it was a darker skin face, darker skin man, darker skin woman, lighter skin man, lighter skin woman. And they were able to determine that the darker skinned women had a very high error rate. I think it was the best of the 3 softwares or systems that were evaluated was like a 33 or so percent like positive assignment. And that's like, oh, so I think it's 33% incorrect assignment. And then that was compared to like a 2% or 1% miscorrect assignment for lighter skinned men. So really just doing great work. That's right. The names are here. Lamwini and Gibru, 2 scientists who did this work, and really having impacts now across the country. So it's all to say that this is not straightforward. No one knows the answers. We're all on a path, but I think we're headed in the right direction. And before we get into any of the data collection, it's important to build trust. So speaking to people, getting them to understand why we're collecting the data, what we hope to do with the data, and basically coming to a point of understanding that without trust, we can't do anything. And so, yeah, that's basically it. This is my cool, fun, self-made coin phrase. So equity is a path function, which I think is real cute. Y'all get it? It's really nice. But yeah, that's everything. So I thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you for that amazing talk. I feel like we have so much reading material.
Yes. Yes, you do know.
So are there any questions for the online people? You can put your questions in the chat. And are there any questions in the room right now? We're happy to take. Sure. Go ahead.
Me to be first. Okay. Thanks for that. It was very interesting, such a great overview. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on something I've been wondering about for a long time. It's sort of this difference we have between the US and Canada in terms of the institutions collecting demographic data and how it's made available. So in the US, sometimes instructors have really easy access to all sorts of data about their students, including if they're Pell eligible or in financial need, even before their course starts. And we just have such a different culture in Canada about that. So I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for your question, Jackie. I think it's kind of nice that, I mean, yes and no, nice or not. I think it's interesting that we have the opportunity to design our systems of data collection with references in mind. So yes, there's, decades, centuries almost of data collected in the American context, but even at the conference I was at in Seattle, oftentimes people would say like, yeah, we collect this data, but we don't necessarily know why. We don't necessarily think about it. And so the advantage here is that we have an opportunity to design the system such that we collect data with intention, collecting the data that we need to answer the questions that we're asking. So not just collecting data just because, and so really intentionally thinking about what is the research question and what are the parameters or what are the factors that we need to answer that most accurately, I think is really, really interesting. In terms of access to data, I know right now, at least for a few colleagues that I have at other post-secondaries, it's largely restricted. So a lot of that is governed by privacy legislation. I know that, for example, at the U of A, They just launched their first student demographics survey last fall, and there's only a very limited number of people out of the provost office who have access to that data. Now, departments and faculties can request that data, but there's a vetting process that they must undergo to ask, what exactly do you need the data for? And so the people who are closest to the data can thereafter pull the data in a way that makes sense. So it's not just kind of a free for all, like just because you want the data, you get the data, because of course we know that, like I said before, the data story is important. So access right now, at least in Canadian post-secondary, is largely limited. But I think that's always done with the idea that people from whom the data is taken should be able to know why. And so it's kind of a balance.
We have a question online, and Nancy, you can feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Thanks very much. First, I really, really enjoyed this. It was all the references and the different studies. No, fantastic. It's really, really, really important work and interesting. I'm involved along with Melissa. Am I echoing, or are you? I don't, is it me that's doing?
You're good.
Oh, okay.
You're good.
Okay. I'm involved with some work along with Melissa and Carol and Taylor, who's not here, I think, with faculty science, looking at the hiring process of faculty. And one highly confidential, as you can imagine. One thing we struggle with, this is a hard question, is non-response. Like, for instance, there's anybody who applies has a survey fill out, and of course that the response rate isn't as high as one would like, and so it's hard to know what to do. As statisticians, we're quite reluctant to base any conclusions on that. And I wonder if you had any insights about how to handle that, both as a statistician for analysis, but also explaining to people why, like, that's kind of dangerous, because people sometimes don't, everybody's doing it, so why can't you? So any comments you might have would be really helpful.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nancy. It's a good question. I think that it's hard if you are collecting it just at the faculty level. Like, I mean, faculties, it's good because it's quite broad, but it's not at the level of the institution. Like, if there were, or what I hope will happen for you is that if hiring practices and research committees from an institutional level are encouraged to collect data, then that will be a push from leadership, which will not be on, the onus therefore won't be on you as a faculty to encourage and or convince people to give their data, because that does make it more challenging for you. The other thing that I'll say is that in terms of like using the data, I mean, you basically said, I'm just parroting, like, if there's too many non-responses, then you can't really use it, right? With small cell sizes and things of the sort. So it's a really hard question to answer, but I know that there are some data that are typically collected from like the institutional level. So for example, if you're HR, if the applicants have to go through human resources or people and culture, some institutions will have them fill out surveys at that point before they're screened into the faculty process. So I would first inquire with the human resources or people and culture department to see what data they have and kind of compare and contrast your processes and or data collection with what's being done at the institutional level. And that way you have at least a comparison for what I would hope would be an institutional support and a reasoning for why you're doing your work. And so it's kind of like a couple of non-answers for you, I'm sorry. But it's tough. It's tough. I think that lots of institutions are figuring it out. The only other thing I would say is that qualitative research is also helpful. So if there is a way for you to ask people directly, like through a phone call or follow up, giving them the information that you're using this for, research or data and getting RAB approval or whatever, but talking to people about why they're not filling out this information and or why they are filling out this information would be really, I think, a powerful way for you to push for more. and to ask more questions.
Yeah, we don't even know who hasn't responded, right? Because it's it's
Right.
anonymous. Yeah,
Right, yeah, right,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thanks for that question. Samir, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. My question is actually related to Nancy, which is, I see there are two different models in getting people to, getting specifically applicants to faculty position to respond to surveys. At the University of Calgary, for example, they have a voluntary census that applicants are asked to fill. And it's totally voluntary in the sense that they don't even have to complete the survey. But at the Toronto Metropolitan University, I think is the new name of University X, they require, it's mandatory for the questionnaire to be completed, but not the question. And I did speak with BC Human Rights Commission to see, is it legal to force folks to complete a survey even if they don't have to complete the question? And they did say yes. And I'm assuming that universities that go that pathway leads to an increase in response rate, but I'm not sure. And my question is, have you seen if requiring the completion of a questionnaire does lead to a higher response rate from applicants or existing employees?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for your question, Samir. Short answer is I don't know. I think that I mean, I kind of like the idea of it being compulsory as long as there's the option of, prefer not to say, or I don't know for every question. And that way it's a way for people to opt out. I think that if it's tied to things like if you have to put in your name and address and your social insurance number and all that stuff, which, information that the university has for you on you already, if there's a way to design at least a short survey, which has some key questions, and the opt-out option. I think that that's a really good way to go. I don't think that should be done without, though. I don't think that should be done without like a communications campaign. Like, I think that there should be some information discussion before an applicant or I guess in this case, a stakeholder member gets to that survey. So basically a conversation about why this is happening, whether that's like a YouTube video or TikTok for the kids or something, like just to let people know like why you're doing it. But I don't actually have an answer to your question. Those are just kind of like my thoughts. Sorry.
Can I just, if I can jump in and say something related? Yeah. I just remembered that science found, anecdotally, that it seemed if you had an electronic application process and the survey was in the same page before it had been separated for quite a few years, because people would send in paper and it wasn't all electronic, but when they were tied together on the same page, it did increase response rate. Well, at least filling out the survey, maybe not answering all the questions, so that a more seamless process.
Yeah, exactly. That makes sense to me. Thanks for that, Nancy.
Any more questions? Oh, go ahead.
This is maybe a little bit related to the same kind of idea of non-response. So one of the things that I think you touched on this a lot earlier, and you're talking about the pipeline and where you're losing people. It sort of strikes me that, for a survey like Nancy was talking about, where we're asking applicants to the job, to self-identify for these various people, what we're really missing is where were the applicants that didn't apply to this job, and how do we collect information on those, and why are they not applying? Because they're the ones that are leaving. They're the ones that are applying.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's like, how do we find out what we don't know if we don't know it, right? It's like that, like unknown kind of paradigm. I think that it depends on what the questions are and what you're hoping to do. So one way to compare or benchmark would be to use a local context, or I guess in the case of the census is looking at like the population across Canada or whatever, and seeing like how do the applicants and or faculty members in this department or faculty compared to, the federal population or provincial or city-wise, and what makes the most sense. There are also different ways to benchmark, like looking at other institutions for a given discipline or faculty. It's really hard to know the right way to find out who's not applying, but what you can do is ask people who are part of, whether that's the faculty or department, about how they think their, I guess, group could change, or what they see happening at other institutions in terms of recruitment as a kind of a starting or jumping off point. But that's it's a hard thing to answer. Yeah, interesting question though.
Go ahead.
Good question. In one of your slides, you have the some surveys like national data. What universities were surveying, or what data universities had collected, and that the one that the president, I think, answered, or I forget. But I think it was a survey done on colleges and universities to see what kind of data they had.
Okay. Yes.
Or they have collected.
Yes.
And whatever. And I think it's the same. It's my experience at BBC as well. That institutions tend to be very happy to poll and survey their employees, but not the students. So that plus the fact that if the institution is holding access and ruling who has access to data, which makes me sometimes a bit nervous.
Yeah,
it's
totally.
the powers that be that are telling me, oh yeah, you can look at the story or not. Yeah, sorry. Do you have any thoughts as to why are institutions so reluctant to poll their students?
Yeah, I actually don't know why. I don't know I'll tell you, maybe it's not a reluctance. I mean, it probably is part of it. So there's two parts of the question. The first part is information about staff and faculty is collected, I think, kind of on a compulsory basis in order to comply with the federal contractors program and employment equity and things that are like instituted at a federal level. So in fact, many institutions have to collect that data. How well they're doing it and how compliant they are is a different thing. But that's why there's any sort of data collection at that level. There isn't that legislation for students, and the push for that now has come mostly from marginalized students, and also just students in general. I think the Gen Zs are very chill. So I think that Canada is so interesting because it is a very multicultural, country, but it's kind of that idea that we're multicultural, right? Like that's good enough, right? And so it's like, and if you don't have the numbers, then you don't have to do anything about it. And that's kind of a cynical view, but there's also the fear of collecting that information and certain groups, institution or certain, people with power having access to the data and then using it in incorrect ways. So wanting to limit that and not wanting that data to be collected for students who are more vulnerable, perhaps as part of that reluctance or hesitancy. Doesn't matter anymore because now I think a lot of universities are collecting it because students want it, and there's a push from funding agencies to have that information. So yeah, there's a lot of factors which go into why we haven't. But hopefully now we're moving in a direction as to why we should, and who has access to that data is a big part of it. That's kind of why I end this discussion on building trust, because yeah, like you said, you're nervous about like why do these people want to know this? And this is the part of the same reason why question Nancy had asked about probably the high non-response rate. If people aren't sure, like if I say that I'm gay, well, does that mean these people are going to judge me and not hire me? Like, so it's complicated, but yeah, I think that with time and some level of like cultural shift where everybody's kind of like on board and understands that it shouldn't be used against certain communities, then hopefully that will encourage more people to participate. Thanks for your question.
I don't know if this is actually what's happening, but right now, because the access is fairly restricted, right? Because you want to be do good stewardship of the data. I wonder sometimes if that tempts people to just collect the data on their own instead of using the data that was collected by a central.
Yeah.
thing.
Oh, for sure.
And so what would be your recommendations in policies to just prevent that? Because sometimes for an instructor, for example, it would be easier to just ask the demographic information directly instead of trying to get information from someone else.
Yeah. I would say that unless it's been vetted by like a research ethics board, like no one should be doing that. Like even if the intention is good, just because that opens up a can of worms in terms of just like legal and privacy matters. If someone's collecting that data, we hope it's for the benefit of the group or the people that the data is being collected from. But that's like opening a whole host of ways that someone can be sued and fired and with good reason, right? Privacy is important, and so I would say that it's not so much that groups or people shouldn't collect the data if they're curious and there's no high level mechanisms to do that. But if they do, then there should be a vetting process which protects the participants, community that they're surveying, and themselves. Yeah, so that would be that's the shortest answer I've given all day. Wow.
Okay, we'll end there so that we can get some food and have a discussion. Thank you to the online people for joining us, and thank you to the audience, and thank you to Dr. Evelyn.